Welcome back to my channel. It's been longer than I wanted it to be. I wanted to get part 2 of this Ken McElroy series up way before now, but my kid got sick, and then I got sick, and then the husband got sick. So what matters is that I'm back, isn't that right? So I'm here to give you part 2 of Ken McElroy's story. Okay, now I don't normally I say I don't normally, like this isn't just my second video, but I'm not going to really give trigger warnings on my channel, on my true crime videos, because they're true crime. So you should know kind of what you're getting yourself into, right? So I just figure it's part and par for the course. However, on this one, I am going to give a little bit of a trigger warning because number 1, it's the first one that we're doing, and number 2, there's a lot to unpack in this part. So trigger warning: sexual abuse, domestic violence, alcohol and drug use, animal abuse, and general douchebaggery. So if any of that bothers you, feel free to exit out. We'll see you again maybe in another video, maybe not. Either way, thanks for watching this long. Now, when we left Ken Rex McElroy, I don't remember. I should probably watch the end of my old video. Hold, please. Okay, we're back. I know where we left off, with Ken Rex McElroy being a D-bag. Got it. So, don't forget to like and subscribe if you want more videos like this. I'm really interested in true crime because I like the psychology, I like the storytelling aspect of it all, and I like having a community where I can discuss this kind of stuff without people thinking that I'm a psychopath. So if you are into that sort of thing, like and subscribe. I'm going to try to get videos up as often as I can, but I make no promises on a regular upload schedule, although, fingers crossed, I'm really hoping that it will be regular. So when we left off, Ken Rex McElroy was approximately 20 years old, and at this time, he befriended a young boy named Larry, who was approximately 11 to 12 years old. So we see a pattern forming here, right, with Ken Rex McElroy. He really enjoys spending his time with people significantly younger than him. And I wonder if this was a sense of control on his part, if he felt like he could control people who were younger than him, or if it was some sort of arrested development situation, failure to launch kind of thing. I'm not sure, because I'm not a psychologist. But what we do know is that Larry came from a poor farming family. They were a rural, poor family. And they were dedicated coon hunters, which I assume is how they got kind of involved with Ken Rex McElroy, because he, as you remember from part 1, was really into raising and breeding and trading dogs, and also coon hunting. And Larry really admired Ken because he just thought he was the bee's knees, because he was older and he was tough. And even though Ken didn't really have a lot, it seemed, he had an old beater car, he was always friendly and generous with Larry. He would buy Larry pops, which, okay, it depends on where you're from. Some people call it soda, some people call it pops. In some places, it is just variations of Coke. Like, hey, I'll have a Coke. Okay, what kind of Coke do you want? Oh, I want a Sprite. That one never really made sense to me. Either way, here in the Midwest, where Ken Rex McElroy lived out his life, it was a pop. So he would buy Larry pop. He would give him rides whenever he needed, and he would give Larry whatever he needed, and it was never brought up again. But during this time, while Larry was admiring Ken, he was also discovering that Ken was very dangerous. So if Ken didn't like someone, or he suspected them of talking poorly about him or someone in his family, that person would leave the tavern and find themselves at the business end of a shotgun or a long-bladed corn knife. And as we discussed in part 1, Ken was a heavy drinker, and when he was drinking, his grievances seemed to get more severe in his mind. They just gnawed at him. So as he got drunker and drunker, he would sit and tell Larry, again, an 11 to 12-year-old boy, I imagine in a pub or in a bar, wild times. He would tell Larry all of his plans for getting revenge and getting even with whomever he believed had wronged him in some way. And Ken was not all talk. He would carry the threats out as Larry watched. So Ken began to frequent a bar in Burlington Junction by himself, usually showing up by himself in his old white Ford. And again, different place, different time, a 17-year-old girl named Barbara T hung out there with several of her girlfriends, and they would hang out at the bar. And they couldn't help but notice Ken, even though when he was there, he would sit by himself at the end of the bar and drink, or sometimes he would join in on a pool game or a shuffleboard game, which I assume meant that he played that with someone else, so he wasn't always a loner, although I can't be certain, and I would never judge, except I'm judging. To be fair, I have played games by myself, with myself, before. I've played both parts of chess. I probably should not have just admitted that because it does not paint the most pro-social picture of yours truly, but it is what it is. Barbara and her friends loved to party, and if there's one thing that we know about Ken, he was a party animal, so they began to spend time and hang out together. They would be somewhere, usually at a bar or at a tavern, and out of nowhere, Ken would just say, "Let's go." And everyone in the group would just get up and go with him, never knowing where he wanted to go. It was usually to somebody else's house in St. Joe's or to another bar or tavern. But they just went. He was in charge. Ken was in charge. And he seemed like a happy-go-lucky sort of guy, unless he drank too much, and then he was a soup's mean drunk, like his father before him. And one thing that Barbara and her friends noticed was that he always had plenty of girls buzzing around him that would be even younger than her and her friends at age 17-ish. And he told those girls not to worry. Quote, "You're too old for me. I like my women young and tender. I like that young meat." End quote. That brings us to a girl named Donna G. She was a 14-year-old girl in town who lived on a farm with her grandparents, and she used to sneak out of the farmhouse in the middle of the night to meet Ken in the bushes and canoodle. Now, her grandparents owned a bar that Ken frequented and often drank at, and one night he was there with his young posse of 17-year-old cohorts. And as he drank more, he began to tease Donna's grandpa. He would say things like, "How are things at the farm? How's Donna doing?" Which, the unmitigated audacity of that man. He would not have left with a full set of his teeth if he were talking about one of my children or grandchildren. I promise you that. And after some time of this teasing, understandably, Donna's grandpa got furious and retorted back, quote, "You stay away from her, gosh dang it, or I'll get the law on you," end quote. Which, that's not exactly a quote. I'm sure you can imagine that he didn't say, "Gosh dang it," but if I were to repeat that on my channel, which I'm not afraid of doing, I'd have to call my mom and tell her I swore on the internet. And that's just not a conversation that I am emotionally prepared to have at this time. And so after this, Ken stopped laughing and he sat perfectly still like the creeper he was, and he stared at the grandpa. And his cohorts, his posse, his young brigade, also fell silent, and within 4 to 5 minutes, they all silently got up and left the tavern. Once they got in the car, Ken announced that they were going to Donna's grandparents' farmhouse, and they were going to burn it down. That escalated quickly, and they shared a bottle of Jack Daniels on the way there. Once they got there, though, he was hungry, so when they went inside, they set about finding the fixings to make sandwiches. Again, the audacity of this man is just incredible. So they began to find the bread and the mayonnaise and the bologna, and they began to make bologna sandwiches. And as they are laughing, and Ken is describing with delight how the farmhouse was going to look, lighting up the countryside with its flames, he heard bed springs and then footsteps on the floor above him. And that startled him, as you can probably imagine. And he said to the others, "That must be Donna's uncle. He's not a bad old guy, doesn't deserve to be burned up anyway. We'll have to come back." So they finished making their sandwiches, they let themselves out of the farmhouse, and they drove away, eating the sandwiches. And a year later, Donna gave birth to Ken's child. This is what canoodling gets you. The more you know. Okay, I'm going to bring you to another character in the story, a girl named Sharon May Fossinger. Fossinger? Her name started with an F. And she began to run around with Ken not long after he and Olita moved back from Denver. As you will recall, he is still married at this time. She was a 15-year-old girl from St. Joe, and she was described as being sweet and unworldly and kind. And as they were running around together, one night they were in Ken's car, and Ken pulled a shotgun on her because they were arguing. And he told Sharon, quote, "Shut up or I'll blow your head off," end quote. Now, girls and guys, if you were going to make a list of red flags or things that potential romantic interests should not say in an early relationship, this should go on there in probably the top 3. Okay? So if they're holding a gun at you and telling you to shut up or they're going to blow your head off, that's a red flag. I know some of us have a really hard time seeing red flags, even when they're waved in our faces, but I'm here to tell you, that's a red flag. It doesn't get any redder. Now, as they were arguing, the shotgun discharged. Either he pulled the trigger on purpose or it was an accident, but either way, it blew under Sharon's chin and tore the bottom of her chin open, which eventually left her with a permanent scar there. So she was not happy, she was very injured, and had to go to the hospital. So what do you think that Ken Rex McElroy would do in a situation like this? Do you think, one, he would apologize profusely and see the error of his ways and say, "Oh, Sharon, I'm so sorry. This was a mistake. I'm psychotic and I don't know what I'm going to do with my life," and got her right to the hospital? Do you think that he drove past the hospital and pushed Sharon out as he continued to drive? Or do you think that he called Olita, his wife and told her that he needed a divorce so he could marry Sharon, so Sharon could not testify against him and he could avoid prosecution for assault with a deadly weapon. If you chose the third one, then you have gotten a pretty good grasp on who our boy Ken McElroy was. Yeah, he called his wife and said he needed a divorce because he needed to marry Sharon so she couldn't testify and he couldn't be prosecuted, which she agreed to. So he and Alita got divorced, and he married Sharon in 1958. In 1959, his first child with Sharon was born, a boy in July named Jerome. So Ken, Sharon, and Jerome moved back into the farmhouse with Mabel, Tony, and Ken's little brother Tim. And Ken was gone a lot. They say later in the story that they believe that he may have had a fear of being stuck on the farm, and so he didn't like to spend a lot of time there. So he left his new bride, his child bride, Sharon, with their newborn baby, at the farmhouse with his father Tony, his mother Mabel, and his brother Tim. And Sharon was a child herself, so they left most of the child care of Jerome to Tony and Mabel. In 1960, when Jerome was about a year old, Tony actually almost backed up over him because he'd been left sitting unattended in the driveway. Ken's sister Helen had come for a visit and she was terribly worried about the safety of little Jerome. So she took Jerome back with her to California to make sure that he didn't get run over by various people. Sharon both loved and feared Ken, and she ended up trying to get away from him more than once, but she wasn't successful. In 1961, their second child, Tammy Sue McElroy, was born, and several weeks after that, Sharon went to Marysville, the sheriff's department there, with the baby in hand. Now, I'd forgotten to mention that after Helen took Jerome back to California, Ken and Sharon moved out of the farmhouse into a tiny home outside of Burlington Junction, where the bar that he used to drink with Barbara and her little friends was. Now, she told the sheriff in a terrified voice that Ken had been gone for 2 days and had locked them in the house. She had no idea where he was. But Sharon had managed to escape and take her and the baby, Tammy Sue, and catch a ride into town. And she was terrified of what Ken would do when he found out that they were missing. A social worker came to talk to Sharon, but Sharon was so terrified that she couldn't keep track of what she was saying. Her eyes were darting all around the office like a caged animal, and she couldn't sit still. The social worker arranged for them to go and stay with a foster family on a farm outside of Graham, another small town located close by. Now, the foster mother's name was Linda, and she and her husband loved children. But unfortunately, despite their years of trying, they were childless. So they began taking in foster children to help spread love as far as they could and do the most good that they could for these children. And she thought Sharon was a shy, sweet, and naive 19-year-old. Sharon desperately wanted to learn homemaking skills. She wanted to learn how to cook. She wanted to learn how to sew and clean. So she would follow Linda around the house as Linda did her various chores, trying to learn these things. And Linda noted that Sharon took excellent care of Tammy Sue. Now, Sharon actually had a false tooth in the front of her mouth, which is probably a souvenir from one of her run-ins with Ken. And when it would come out, Linda thought that Sharon looked pretty silly with that. And as they were there, Sharon also was talking to Linda about her life, about things with Ken. And Linda learned that Ken had brought a 14-year-old girl named Sally D to the farmhouse to live, and he would both canoodle with and beat both of them, kind of alternating, deciding who got what when. And Sharon wanted out. She was done. She hated that. So she stayed with Linda for approximately 6 weeks. So the prosecutor had filed a complaint against Ken, charging him with assault with a deadly weapon, and they brought Sharon to the courthouse to sign it. The sheriff's office and the state patrol had been warned, and they were alerted to stand by to execute the arrest warrant as soon as it was issued. However, for some reason, there were people in the town that were still loyal to Ken, and he found out what was going on. So he went to the prosecutor's office and demanded to be able to speak with his wife. And the social worker, whomever this person was, stood up to Ken McElroy and said, "You can't talk to her until you talk to the judge about it," and he gives the okay. So Ken did. He spoke to the judge, and the meeting was granted on the condition that it take place in the prosecutor's office. And while it was there, Ken McElroy, who apparently could be charming, managed to sweet-talk Sharon into coming back with him by promising to bring Jerome, their firstborn, who had gone to California with his sister Helen. He promised to bring Jerome back home so that they could have him and they'd be a family. And that won Sharon over because most mothers are deeply loyal to their children. And Sharon told prosecutors that she wouldn't sign the papers. So that night, Ken showed up. Sharon gathered all of her things and Tammy Sue's things, and they all left together. And later on, sometime down the road, Kenda would learn how very terribly Ken had beaten Sharon that night for running away. Now let's go back to Sally, that I mentioned in passing. That was quite the bomb I threw at you. 14-year-old Sally D. She was skinny and gawky, with strawberry blonde hair, brown eyes, and light freckles. So let's set aside the fact that all of these girls, these women that Ken is chasing, are children. They are legitimately children. When I was 14, that's not a particularly graceful time for most people. It's kind of an awkward time. So I'm not sure exactly what Ken was seeing that delighted him, but I can also see how girls who are feeling very self-conscious of how they are at that particular time in life may be even more willing to throw their lot in with an older man who's paying them attention. Ken was an idiot, but he wasn't dumb. Sally's mother had died when she was young, and so this obviously left her more vulnerable. She lived in Quitman with her brothers and her father, who was a butcher. And in 1960, when she began throwing in with Ken, she was 13. And at that age, especially at that time, and with how she was as a person, she would believe pretty much what an adult said to her. Ken hunted coons and traded dogs with one of her brothers, and that is how she kind of got to run around with him. At first, he would pick her up and give her rides, and she trusted him. So he would pick her up after school and buy her candy and gifts. And another boy in the town named Kirby Gosley, who was in junior high with Sally, thought she was awfully cute and had arranged to meet her at one of the junior high dances. But he drove past her house the day before and saw Ken's car parked in the driveway, and knowing Ken McElroy, decided to forget the entire thing. One night, Sally was dumped out of the car, screaming and bleeding with her clothes torn on a lawn in town. And the people who owned the lawn, I imagine, took her to hospital, and they reported later that it looked like, quote, an animal hit on her, end quote. And a few days later, Ken, ever the charmer, threatened to kill Sally's father if she didn't come back. So she moved back in with him and Sharon. Now, Ken and Larry, the 11 to 12-year-old boy around this time, they began to steal together. And sometimes after, they would go to Ken's house to kind of, I imagine, come down from everything. And after one excursion, they came back at about 1 a.m., and Ken undressed and climbed into one of 3 beds there in the bedroom. And after a time, Sharon began to complain to Larry that Ken seemed to favor Sally and took her places with him where he used to take Sharon. And Sharon was convinced that he liked Sally better than he liked her. Larry told her nervously, quote, you'd better be quiet. Ken might not be asleep yet, end quote. And he was not. So he got out of bed after hearing this. I thought I was able to cover this up. I need to buy some curtains. Next time you see me, hopefully I have curtains. That's how you'll know I'm fancy. So Ken got out of bed and he said, quote, hey Larry, have you ever seen the Saturday night fights? End quote. He began to hit and knock Sharon around the room until she could barely stand. And Ken, as I said earlier, would go from one to the other, one room to the other, either canoodling with them or beating them. Which, it said just a minute ago that there were 3 beds in the bedroom, which I thought must probably be one for Sally, one for Sharon, and one for Ken. I can't back that up though, and it appears that at some point, Sally and Sharon had their own separate bedrooms. So Sally began having Ken's children as well. Ken Jr. came in 1961, Lisa in 1963, and Jeffrey in 1964. And at the same time, Sharon was also having Ken's children. Teresa Lynn in 1963, Tina Renee in 1964, and Debbie Ann in 1965. So at one point, Sharon and Sally were actually in the same hospital at the same time, both giving birth to Ken's child. And during this time period, Ken's thieving grew more sophisticated. He had developed a network of girlfriends that he would take the stolen animals to, and they would sell them at auction under their own names, so as not to draw attention to the fact that Ken was a rustler. He would stop by a few days later to gather up his money. He would canoodle with the women, as I'm certain you know what we've established that means by now, and then he would give them a little something for their trouble. And as I said earlier, Ken and Larry were heavy drinkers. And Ken had to be about mid-20s by this time, and Larry was probably in, 15, 16 range. However, Ken would not let Larry drink while they were thieving because that was serious business, and they must concentrate when they are taking things from other people. They needed their wits about them to steal other people's animals. Larry noted that Ken would wear old boots he'd picked up somewhere that he could then throw away after the fact, especially if the fields were muddy. And one night he loaded his shotgun and he told Larry to begin gathering the cattle. He said, quote, if anybody comes, you take off and get out of the way, because I'm going to kill that son of a bitch, end quote. Now I have to call my mom, tell her I swore on the internet. Sorry. And that night they stole 2 500-pound steers and then took them to a friend's in St. Joe's. Once Sally was done having Ken's children, he was done with her. Her father had died, so he had little to no hold over her anymore. And he had a new girlfriend in St. Joe, so Sally outgrew him, outgrew his tastes. So Sally took the 3 kids and she moved into an apartment in St. Joe. And she had trouble keeping a job, but she took good care of her children. Until one night, one of Sally's friends convinced her to go out to a party in St. Joe, promising Sally that this friend had a reliable, responsible babysitter all lined up for Sally. So Sally allowed herself to be taken to this party. The babysitter was a local teenage girl who invited her friends and boys over, and they drank and they partied, and they threw bottles off the roof, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, brought the attention of the neighbors, who called the police. And when the police arrived and found no responsible adult present, they took the children. They took the children into custody, and Sally was heartbroken. The county then filed dependency and neglect charges and placed the children in foster care. And Sally, as heartbroken as she was, she had no friends, she had no family, she had no support system, and she had no money to fight, so she just disappeared. If you recall, Linda, the foster mother from earlier who Sharon stayed with after she escaped Ken, was the foster home where the 3 children went. They discovered pretty quickly that Jeffrey the baby had a hernia, and they decided that their farmhouse was too far outside of town, too far away from medical care, so Jeffrey had to be sent to live with a different family. Linda and her husband fell in love with Ken Jr. and Lisa. Ken Jr. was 3 and he had blonde hair and blue eyes and a mischievous little face. And Lisa was 2 with blonde curls that framed her face. Sally did have visiting rights, but in the almost 2 years that Linda had the children, she never came once, and neither did Ken. Ken seemed to show no interest in these children that he'd had with Sally. So the county initiated proceedings to terminate the parental rights and placed Ken Jr. and Lisa for adoption. And Sally did not contest this decision. She showed up for the final hearing and didn't contest, as I said, and the children barely recognized her. And Linda observed as Sally played with them for a few minutes in the hall, childlike herself. But the kids got excited to go, as kids will do, and Ken Jr. said to Linda, "Come on, Mom, let's get in the car and go." And Sally knelt and hugged the kids and brushed the hair from their foreheads and looked each one in the eye and whispered goodbye. And then she stood, and Linda watched as she walked slowly away. This part of the story gets me. My goodness. No. I run on hatred and caffeine, and right now it's just caffeine. So this is not happening. Not happening. We're not doing this. Okay, I'm back. As a mother, that breaks my heart. I'm sure you can imagine. Unless you have no heart, and then I'm sorry for you. Now, Ken Jr. and Lisa seemed to be okay, as Linda prepared them to be adopted by their new parents. And on the way to the new parents' car, Ken Jr. said to Linda, quote, "You know, you gave Jeffrey away, and he never came back." And that broke Linda's heart. There's lots of heartbreaking going around. I don't like it. Not a fan. And right before he got in the new adoptive parents' car, Ken Jr. turned to Linda and said, quote, "Mom, someday you'll hear a knocking on your door, and it'll be me," end quote. And Linda and her husband never forgot the McElroy children. Out of all of the children that they had fostered, she had produced a picture of the children that she placed in a place of honor in her scrapbook among the pictures of all the children that she and her husband had fostered. And she heard later that Sally had ended up staying in a mental hospital and had become a sex worker, but she was never able to corroborate that information. Now, an interesting fact is not long after In Broad Daylight by Harry MacLean was published in 1988, the author, Harry, received a phone call from a man who had read this book and had been putting the pieces together, and his name was Jeffrey, and he had been adopted as a baby, and he had blonde hair, and he'd had a hernia, and it was the same area. He thought he might be Jeffrey McElroy, and he was. So Harry and Jeffrey began talking, Harry answering any questions that Jeffrey had. And about a week later, Harry received another surprise phone call at approximately 2 a.m. from a distraught and drunken woman this time. It was Sally, which, again, I don't know if Sally is actually her name. It's kind of given in quotes in the book, so it could possibly just be a pseudonym because she didn't agree, or maybe she wasn't in a place to agree to be in this book by name, and so they just kind of gave her a pseudonym. Anyway, Sally was angry about how he had portrayed her in the book, as if she didn't love her children, as if she hadn't fought for them, and as if she had just left them behind. She blamed the social workers and the nurses for pressuring and manipulating her to place the children for adoption, and that she had never stopped loving them. As soon as Harry could get a word in edgewise, he actually revealed to Sally that he had been talking on the regular with Jeffrey, and if Sally would like, he could approach Jeffrey about giving Jeffrey Sally's contact information so maybe they could speak. And after a silent minute or two, Sally said, "Yes, please please. She was quite eager. So Harry approached Jeffrey and told him the information, gave him the information about Sally, and they got in contact in an attempt to pull her out of a downward alcoholic spiral. He also met his other siblings, Ken Jr. and his sister, which I imagine is Lisa, although she may not go by that name anymore. And she lived in St. Joe, and she wanted nothing to do with Jeffrey or Ken Jr. or any of her biological family, which was a kick in the gut for Jeffrey, I imagine. And things with Sally didn't go well either, because eventually Jeffrey returned to Kansas City and had gone no contact with any of his biological family. So Ken Rex McElroy was well known by law enforcement, as you can probably imagine, but them actually proving that he'd done anything was another story. No one seemed to be able to make any charges stick against him, and none of the law enforcement officers dared to turn their backs on him. Every time something happened and they would come around his house to investigate, he just wouldn't speak to them, and he would not allow them to look around the place without a warrant. And he would say, quote, "If you think you've got a case against me, prove it," end quote. And branding wasn't really a thing at that time at that place. So unless the farmers caught him stealing one of their animals out of their fields red-handed, they couldn't really prove that the animal was theirs. Now, a couple of charges were filed against Ken in those days. One by a woman who later dismissed it, which I'm sure you're all shocked by, and one by a farmer who had caught Ken while he was stealing 2 of his horses. And the farmer also withdrew his charge after Ken hit him in the face with the butt of his rifle. That'll do it. Okay, so let's go back to 1961, and Ken met a young girl named Alice Wood. Alice was 15 with brown hair and blue eyes, and Ken was 26. Alice worked as a clerk in Herman's drugstore in St. Joe. And she met Ken when he came into the drugstore with the boyfriend of a fellow clerk. And she thought he was charming and dark and handsome and well-built, and he spent money like it was nothing. Because it was. Because he got it from stealing things from other people. And Alice was impressed. Now, like most of these other women, girls in Ken's life, Alice didn't have the best experiences with men. She never knew her father, but her mother told her that her father walked out when Alice was a baby, and that he was also an alcoholic, and her mother would never let him actually come and see the children. Now, when Alice was an adult, he would start to come around a little more often, but only when he needed something from her. After the father left, Alice's mother married a man named Otha Embry, and Alice disliked him from the very beginning. Alice would allege that he would come home angry and drunk and was very abusive, but allegedly Alice's mother saw no issues. Now, women and men, but mostly women, single mothers, don't do this, okay? If you have kids and you're a single parent, don't be so desperate for companionship that you are willing to put your children last. Put them in the bullseye of a D-bag, per se. Just don't sell out your child's well-being just to feel wanted. Just don't. There are plenty of men out there, and plenty of time to find a partner later. Treasure yourselves and your children. Rant over. When Alice was 13, she ran away from home and moved into an apartment with a friend. So she had lived away from home for 2 years by the time that Ken met her when she was working at the drugstore at 15. And she was young and naive and had no real family support. All of the things that Ken looked for in a partner. Are we seeing a pattern? In 1964, Ken left Sharon and the kids at the farm in Skidmore and moved in with Alice. Alice was like a little girl looking for a father figure. But again, Ken was almost never around. Whether he was gone for 2 days or 2 weeks, he gave no explanations and no apologies. He was free to come and go, but Alice sure wasn't. She had to be there whenever he came home to keep his house, satisfy his needs, and make no demands of her own. Questions or even small signs or shows of independence risked a beating. And when Ken was drinking, again, he flew into violent rages over small things. If he didn't appreciate whatever look she gave him. If another man spoke to her on the street or even just said hello. If she complained at all about him being gone. If he remembered something from the past that someone else had done and was working himself into a frenzy, even if she tried to calm him down or reason with him, he immediately identified her as the enemy, and for all of these things he would backhand her or drag her around the room. And Ken never once apologized in all the years that he beat her. Every beating in his eyes was her own fault. Toxic masculinity. I hate the tropes, right? You know, and the buzzwords, the social buzzwords, but this really is toxic masculinity at its finest. And after one of these beatings, Alice would be so black and blue and swollen that she would be ashamed to go outside. And more than once during these beatings, Alice fantasized about grabbing one of Ken's guns and shooting him. Which may or may not be foreshadowing. One time after he'd been away for some time, he came home to see Alice packing boxes, and he flew into a rage before Alice could explain to him that she was just packing clothes away for storage. She wasn't trying to leave him. He grabbed her by the hair on her head and swung her into a wall, leaving a bald spot on her head and bruises all over her face and body. And Alice hated that he had other women, right? She had a schoolgirl vision kind of what love and monogamy should be like. And she thought that he would settle down once they lived together. Girls, again, don't think this. It is not your job to fix men, right? It's not your job to settle men down. That's above your pay grade. It's not your job. Don't do it. Don't fall into this trap. Find a man who's willing to fix himself. All right? Okay. Glad we had this talk. Okay, so women were like possessions to Ken Rex McElroy. They were objects to be collected. That proved that he was more of a man than the next man. And so as he collected women, he was even more manly. And the younger the women, the better. So Alice and Ken moved to Amazonia, where Alice soon grew pregnant and gave birth to a stillborn baby. Then in 1968, on September 19th to be exact, Juarez McElroy was born. Sharon and her 4 kids moved to Florida to live with her mother. And around that same time, Ken began to throw in with a man that was about 10 years younger than him, named Fred M. They had met at a dog meet in Bedford, and Fred was a thief also, although his preferred thing to steal was guns. So he became associates with Ken because Ken was bigger and better at stealing. Ken knew which farmhouses had valuable furniture and guns. He knew when the residents were going to be away. He knew how to get into the house, and he knew where to dispose of the stolen goods, and he had more guts than any other man. Now, as he had with Larry, Ken treated Fred very well. He treated him like a son, almost. Once, Fred wanted a job in a town about 100 miles away, and he didn't have any money or any way to get there. So Ken just gave him $300 to buy a car and $100 for gas, and then never mentioned it again. And one night, they were playing pool in a tavern, and Ken won all of Fred's money, his watch, and his ring. But then at the end of the night, he gave it all back to Fred with a genial smile and a pat on the back. I guess it's easy to give money away when it's not really yours. Mind-boggling. That brings us to February 7th, 1969. The Farmers Co-op warehouse in Leona was broken into, and several cases of a new herbicide were taken. Now, this new herbicide was so expensive that a trunk full could easily hold more than $1,000 worth. And then 2 nights later, it was burglarized again. And the police knew that it was Ken, right? They knew, but they just couldn't prove it. So they knew that if he had done it twice, he would do it again. It seemed to be an easy score for him. So the co-op hired an elderly watchman and gave him a 20-gauge shotgun. And 5 nights later, Valentine's night, February 14th, 1969, the watchman was doing his rounds when he heard the sounds of someone breaking in. He saw these figures and he yelled at them to stop, but they ran. So he fired his shotgun at them, and then he called the sheriff's department. The undersheriff got the call and he jumped in his car to speed his way there. But as he was driving, he passed a yellow Cadillac flying past him at about 65 miles per hour on a snowy and icy night where anything above 35 to 40 was dangerous. So the undersheriff flipped a U and tried to catch them, but he couldn't safely drive fast enough to catch up to them. So he lost the caddy. Sometime later, Jen McCubbin, the special agent for the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, who was assigned to the case, learned that Ken Rex McElroy had gone to a hospital and had some buckshot removed from his hiney that same night. And it turns out that the buckshot matched the 20-gauge shotgun they had given to the watchman. They brought Ken in for questioning, and of course he denied everything. And on October 27th, 1971, prosecutors in Doniphan County filed an indictment charging Ken and one other man with 5 counts of burglary and theft. The judge in Troy issued arrest warrants and also a request for extradition to their county. However, for whatever reason, these warrants were never executed and he was never prosecuted. Okay. Another character in the story, and a pretty major character in the story, is a man named Richard Dean Stratton, known as Dean to his friends and Stratton to McElroy. In the early 60s, he had joined the Missouri Highway Patrol, and he quickly gained the reputation for being the only cop who was not afraid of Ken Rex McElroy. He appeared to be an easygoing man, quick to smile and relaxed. However, he changed almost physically when he was on the job. His spine seemed to stiffen, and his moves were more studied and graceful. He felt it was important from the very beginning that he get to know the people of the towns that he served. He served a lot of small towns as he worked for the sheriff's department, so he would park in front of Mom's Cafe in Skidmore and drink coffee and chat with the residents. And he would always pick up his check when it was his turn. He would hunt and fish with the local boys, and he could talk corn prices and farming with anyone in the town, man or woman. People began to respect him. One of the very first conversations he ever had with his sergeant as he became a police officer was actually about Ken Rex McElroy. His sergeant told him, quote, "He's a rogue and a troublemaker. He's a thief and a bully who will use a shotgun. Don't ever trust him and don't ever turn your back on him." End quote. So one night while Richard Dean Stratton was doing his patrolling, he pulled Ken Rex McElroy over. So he saw that the bed of his green pickup truck was sagging under the weight of 4 hogs. So when he pulled him over and he wandered up to the window, he said, "Whose hogs are those?" Ken Rex gave an indistinct and evasive reply, and Stratton asked, quote, "Did you steal those hogs, Ken?" End quote. Ken's face darkened, and he said, "Gosh dang it, you're just like everyone else around here. You think I steal hogs for a living." "It's 'cause you do, Ken. You don't get to be offended when someone calls you out on something that you actually do. That's illegal. It's not a thing that you get. It's not a privilege that you get. So knock it off." I'm talking to him like he's not dead. Anyway, to anybody else, if someone calls you out on some illegal crap you're doing, you don't get to be offended because of the stuff that you're doing. So now, Ken Rex, always Mr. Excitable McElroy, pulled a shotgun and pointed the barrel out the window directly in Dean Stratton's face. And his finger was on the trigger. Now, I don't know if you are familiar with gun safety, gun protocol, etc., but you do not put your finger on the trigger of a gun. Well, first of all, you don't point your gun at anything you don't want to die, right? And you don't put your finger on the trigger until you are ready to shoot, till seconds before you're ready to pull it. That is just gun safety. Okay, so Ken Rex there were 0 cares to give here. He gave 0 cares. He had his gun pointed at a police officer and his finger on the trigger. And it had been so fast that Stratton hadn't even pulled his gun. He didn't have his pistol unholstered as he approached the door of the truck. So he knew that his only hope was just to back off and hope that Ken wouldn't shoot him, which he did. He slowly walked backwards away from the window as Ken watched him with his heavily hooded dark eyes. And Stratton, oh my gosh, Stratton was such a bad A. This is what he said. He said, quote, "Okay, this time is yours, but the next time we meet, I'll be ready for you. When I come for you, I'll get you." End quote. Mic drop. Oh, boom. Yeah, what are you doing, Ken Rex McElroy? You think you're bad. I don't know what that was. I've been in this room by myself for a very long time. Anywho, this incident, as you can imagine, stuck with Stratton. He knew that he had been young and cocky, and it easily could have gone the other way. And because he had been so unprepared, he began to keep track of Ken. He learned who he ran with, where he hung out, info about Ken's various women, and the makes and models of all of his vehicles. And he never missed a chance to pull Ken over. At least 12 times over the course of the years. For speeding, invalid registration, a dragging muffler, faulty headlight, and any other infraction that he could find. And he just waited for the time that he would be able to even things up. Now, in early 1970, Ken Rex actually went on a spree of violence and crime, and it resulted in 19 felony charges against him. So when it came to justice and the law, Ken lived his life by 2 very simple rules. Rule number 1, if you delay a case long enough, a witness may disappear or forget what they've seen. Right. Rule number 2, no witness, no case. So when Juarez was 3, Alice took off. She had had enough. She couldn't do it anymore. So she went to her mother and stepfather's house, and when Ken found out, he called her up and demanded that she bring his favorite child, Juarez, back to him. So this was in 1972, and he called her and he said, "I'm coming for Juarez, and I'm going to take him whether you come or not." And Alice said no, which really surprised Ken, because the threat of taking Juarez and not allowing Alice to see him anymore was one of the only things that he was able to hold over her head. Like I said, she went to her mother and stepfather's, and she even got a .32 caliber pistol to protect herself. Now, guns need some training and some practice and some knowledge, some know-how. They're not just point and shoot, which, I guess they are, but anyway. One day, as Alice was sitting at the kitchen table, attempting to load her new pistol, she accidentally discharged it and shot herself in the thigh. So she was rushed to the hospital, Methodist Hospital, and admitted into intensive care for a week, because the thigh is a place that you just don't want to lose blood from. And if you break the bone, it really hurts and takes a long time to heal. In fact, the bullet could never be removed safely from Alice's thigh. She had that bullet in there for the rest of her life. So Ken called Alice's mother and stepfather's house looking for her that very night. And Otha, Alice's stepfather, reported to Ken that she was in the hospital. And he said, "Well, I'm coming for Juarez, and I'll shoot anybody that gets in my way." And Otha, the stepfather, said, quote, "The hell you will," end quote. That's what we like to see. So later on, Otha saw through the front room windows Ken actually approaching the house with a rifle. So Otha rushed out of the room, grabbed his own shotgun, and came back into the living room. But Ken had disappeared. He was nowhere to be found. After waiting for a while, on edge, thinking that Ken was going to pop up and shoot him anytime. After a large amount of time, Otha actually returned to put his gun away. And when he came back into the front room, a bullet tore through the front room window and shot him in his left thigh. Now, Otha saw Ken clutching the weapon and running back to his truck. Otha went to the very same hospital that his stepdaughter was currently in that same night, and then was also released that same night. Later, McElroy would tell his lawyers that he had stood across the street and shouted for Otha to come outside, and then he'd hidden by his truck and fired a .22 through the window at him, which is not at all like a huge coward. So 3 months later, the Buchanan County prosecutor filed a felony assault charge against Ken Rex McElroy for this shooting against Otha. And after that was filed, life for Otha and his family became a living hell. McElroy was essentially an emotional terrorist, right? He called them at least once every day and every night, threatening to kill Otha on his way to work, to kill his wife when she was home alone, or even to shoot their child while their child was on the playground. There are some things you don't do, okay? You don't threaten people's families. It's not a thing that we do. It will not end well for you. Got it? He would also drive past the house repeatedly and follow Otha in his car. So because of all of this harassment and taunting, Otha began carrying a gun with him wherever he went. It's so hot. I can't have my overhead fan going because it creaks, and that would mess with the audio, right? So I'm just breaking momentarily. Because I can't have the door open, and I can't crack the window because I live in a complex and there are kids playing and screaming outside, and I have my own kid playing and screaming not in this room, so I can't have the door open, so it's real hot in here with these lights. Okay, so after a couple of months of this constant harassment, Ken called Otha and demanded that he come outside so they could handle this man-to-man. And there's only so much of this kind of terrorism that a man can take, that anyone can take, really. Doesn't matter on what gender you identify as. There's only so much torture that you can take. So Otha was fed up. So he did. He went out on the lawn, but Ken was nowhere to be seen. However, Ken called him later to say that he had seen him standing on his lawn and to describe it to him, just taunting him, that Ken had been there, unseen, and could have done whatever he wanted. January 10th, 1973, Ken actually came to confront Otha at Garland's Tavern in St. Joe's, and he pulled out a corn knife. I'll put a picture of a corn knife here. They're not real fun. And he said, quote, "I'll cut your guts out unless you swear not to testify," end quote. I gotta give it to him. He has some creative threats. I'm gonna give him, I don't know, C+. But Otha stood his ground, and he pulled a chair between them and refused to back down. And Ken left, actually, which was surprising. But then he came back several minutes later, carrying an automatic 12-gauge shotgun. He locked the doors behind him and yelled at the tavern owners to shut the place down. Nobody's leaving here. Nobody's even going to the gosh dang bathroom. And again, he doesn't say gosh dang. I'm just trying to be a better person. To Otha, he said, quote, "I'm going to kill you unless you swear not to testify," end quote. And he pointed the shotgun in Otha's face, and he pulled the hammer back, and he placed his finger on the trigger. And again, with his creativity, right? He said, "I'm going to start at your feet and shoot all the way up until there's nothing left of you." It's creative. And Otha prepared himself to die, as Ken kept screaming that he would blow his head off unless Otha swore not to testify. It was kind of like a standstill. No one in the bar was saying anything. Ken fired one final shot into the floor and backed out of the tavern, still cursing Otha. Now, of course, the police were called, but by the time they showed up, by the time that the police showed up to the tavern, everybody except for Otha and a couple of bartenders and maybe a handful of other customers, they dipped. They were out. They went home. They knew all about Ken Rex McElroy. So Ken was arrested again, and again, he was released on a $1,500 bail. So they filed charges of felony assault and attempting to deter a witness. Now, for some reason, on March 2nd, these felonies were dismissed and refiled as misdemeanors, which instead of attempting to deter a witness, attempting to bribe a witness not to testify, which Ken threatened him with a shotgun. So what was he bribing him with? I guess you could say that he was bribing him with his own life. Because bribes, a bribe has to be you getting something that is advantageous to you in exchange for doing or not doing something that the briber wants or doesn't want to happen. So he threatened him with a shotgun. So was he, I guess you could say he was bribing him with his life. Like, if you don't testify, I will give you your life and not take it. I don't know, it's pushing it. Now, Richard Gene McFadden was a big city trial lawyer from Kansas City. And Ken had approached him about being his lawyer on these charges. And McFadden told Ken that he didn't think he could afford him. He took in Ken in kind of his countrified clothes and his accent. And he said, I don't think you can afford me, boy. And Ken said, let me be the judge of that. So McFadden listened to the details about his case anyway, and then he quoted him about $3,000 for both cases and $1,000 up front as a retainer. And to his utter shock and surprise, Ken Rex McElroy pulled a wad of bills out of his pants and slammed it on the table. And McFadden told him, well, you just hired yourself a lawyer. And later, after everything had gone down, McFadden would say that Ken had been one of his best clients. He never complained about the fees. He always paid on time and in cash, and he kept coming back. Dream client. So on April 27th, 1973, this downgraded to misdemeanor charge was tried in front of the local magistrate. And all that testified, but the bartender who had been there backed out of testifying. He said he ain't seen nothing. He didn't see what happened. He didn't hear anything. He heard nothing. He saw nothing. And on the stand, Ken admitted that he had a gun in the tavern, but said that it was to show someone who wanted to purchase it, and that it went off by accident. Alice actually testified for Ken as a character witness. She told the court that he was a fine, upstanding person, an upstanding citizen of the community. And after this trial, he was actually found guilty and sentenced to 6 months in prison. However, as just about anyone could have foreseen, the charges didn't stick. You're just going to have to deal with this light right here, because when I tried to cover it up, the lighting went all orange. Yeah, so I am bathed in angelic light, and that's just what it is. So, the very first time he was actually convicted of something, it didn't stick. Because on May 4th, 1973, McFadden filed notice of an appeal with the court, which would have resulted in a new trial. However, mysteriously, one day later, all of the files regarding this case in the clerk's office were mysteriously sealed. And according to Missouri law, records must be sealed in cases where the defendant is either acquitted or the charges were dropped by a prosecutor. Now, the charges would only be dropped by a prosecutor if there was something major to happen in the case, like the loss of a critical piece of evidence, such as a key witness. So Otha never knew what came of the bribery case, but he told the prosecutor after 2 years that if he wasn't going to try Ken, then they should just drop it so that his family can get back to living in peace. And no one ever said anything else about it ever again. Ken kept stealing hogs, and the farmers were pissed that there weren't enough cops to cover the county. They never knew when or where McElroy was going to strike. They estimated that over a 3-month period, about $100,000 worth of hogs and cattle had been stolen. So in 1969, enter Marcia Surite. Marcia, also known as Marty. She was widely known as the most attractive of Ken's girls, with black hair, a fair complexion, and large brown eyes. And in 1971, she had a child with Ken named Tony. So one day, Alice and Marty were driving along in a car, and they were pulled over because the police officer recognized that their car was just jam-packed full of things. And once they were pulled over, they saw that it was loaded with tools and furniture. Police attempted to trace these items back to several recent burglaries, but they couldn't trace them. So they took the women in for questioning, and they pushed them pretty hard about what they knew about Ken. And eventually Alice broke. And for the next 2 days, Alice and Marty drove all over the county with the sheriffs pointing out farms that they had robbed or stolen hogs or cattle from. And shortly after this, Marty actually signed 2 statements regarding the question and answer sessions. Records had indicated that Alice and Marty had taken some livestock to one of the auction barns in Oregon, Missouri, because they had received receipts in their names. So police knew that Ken would show up on the day of the sale to get his money, and when he did, they were able to arrest him. So they arrested him for hog theft, and he was, of course, bonded out. When he was pulled over and they tried to arrest him, the cuffs were far too small. This man was beefy. He was as beefy as the beef he was stealing. That was electric. You're welcome. So they couldn't handcuff him. So one of the patrolmen with Sheriff Reed Miller asked what they should do. So Sheriff Miller decided to put Ken in the passenger seat of his patrol car and have the patrolman follow closely behind. When he got in, he slid the barrel of his .357 Magnum pistol, which had no safety, under his left leg, pointing it directly at Ken. And he said, quote, "Ken, you grab me or make a move and I'll kill you," end quote. Ken said, "I won't do nothing," end quote. Sheriff Miller said, quote, "I hope not, because if I don't get you, the trooper behind us will," end quote. And again, all Ken said was, "I won't do nothing," So as he was being booked at the station, Ken was overly friendly and gregarious, and he told some of the officers there, quote, "I'll be out in a few hours," end quote. So McFadden was called, a bond hearing was held, and Ken was actually released the next morning on bond. But before they released him, they actually sent an undercover police officer in, kind of dressed as a drunken farmer, to try to get Ken to admit to anything. And this officer talked to him all night, but Ken said nothing. The prosecution decided to grant Alice and Marty full immunity in all of the theft and burglary cases because the case hinged on their testimony. And Richard McFadden knew this. He knew that the case rested entirely on the testimony of these two women. Now, Richard McFadden called himself a hired gun. He said it was his job to explore and exploit every single loophole that he could find in the law for the benefit of his clients. He would tiptoe right on the line of legality, but he never quite crossed it in a way that he could be held accountable for. And so after he realized that there was no case without these two women, about a year after the incidents, he took depositions from the two, and they both recanted and claimed to have been threatened and coerced into their statements. They said, quote, they'd been mad at Ken and said these things to get even, end quote. I'm sure you can imagine the prosecutor was not happy with this. He threatened right there in the deposition to charge Alice and Marty with perjury. And Alice turned to McFadden and asked if he would represent her on the impending perjury charges, but he said no because clearly it would be a conflict of interest. However, no charges of perjury were filed, and nothing really came except that the hog and cattle wrestling in the county had stopped. 1970, Ken's father, Tony, passes away. And as could probably be expected, Mabel took it very hard. She and Ken's younger brother, Tim, actually moved out of the farmhouse into the small house down the road. Throughout the course of all of this that had been going on, Alice had turned to Mabel for comfort. She would complain about the beatings that Ken would give her about his other women. She would complain and confide in Mabel, and Mabel was always non-judgmental and caring and would listen. And if there was anyone on this planet that Ken Rex McElroy could confide in, it was also his mother, Mabel. She listened and tried to give him advice without being judgmental, but she knew what he was up to. She was the one who had to put up a surety bond every time he was arrested when they went to court. She literally bailed him out. The only time she really got upset with him was when she found out that he was going to, quote, divorce Alice to marry the little blonde girl from Graham, end quote. I don't think Alice and he were ever really married. I couldn't find a date, but I'm not certain. So don't quote me. Enter Trina Louise McLeod, soon to be McElroy. Born on January 24th in 1957 in Horton, Kansas. Trina's father, Clarence Otto McLeod, left to run an errand when Trina's mother, Treva, was about 7 months pregnant with her, and he never came back. So he went out to get a gallon of milk, and 15 years later, he still wasn't there with the milk, kind of thing. Years later, Treva would tell Trina that he left because, quote, he didn't want you, end quote. That's a messed up thing. You don't tell kids that. Just don't do it. So after Trina was born, Treva wasn't ready to settle down, which is weird because she had already been settled down, married and expecting a kid. But apparently when Clarence left, that reset her settling down clock, and she needed more time to come back down to that settling down level. So Treva left Trina with her parents in Whiting and went to St. Joe to seek her fortune with her sister Brenda. There she met a man named Ronald McNeely. He was slender and slight to the point where he was ironically nicknamed Muscles throughout his whole life. They married in 1963 and eventually brought Trina to live with the family and be part of the family from Kansas when she was almost 7. Trina was described as a quiet, gentle, and shy child, and she was beautiful with blue eyes and blonde hair and a fair complexion. But she was also described as a little chubby. This could literally be about me. Beautiful but chubby. It's my cross to bear. Treva and Ronald eventually had more children, so Trina was the big sister to 3 younger brothers and a younger sister. And she was a good older sister. They all nicknamed her Sissy. Now, she kept Clarence McLeod's last name, but soon she took to calling Ronald Dad. A friend of Trina's would recall years later staying over at Trina's house. She remembered Treva sitting and smoking and drinking coffee while ordering Trina to cook breakfast, do the laundry, or fetch water. So the McNeelys were a poor rural family, so Trina never really fit in when she went to school. Other kids thought of her as rough because of her country manners and her worn old clothes. Because in Trina's neck of the wood, education was not priority number 1. Priority number 1, find a decent job. Number 2, get married. And number 3, have a family. And their hobbies usually consisted of coon hunting, trapping, and drinking. She was friendly if she was approached, but she usually hung back by herself. She never had her homework done, and she had difficulty following the teacher's instructions, so she would look over other students' shoulders, but she did excel in sports, mainly track and basketball. Every school has kind of the favorite teacher who has worked hard and made a difference through many generations of students. And in Skidmore, that was Kathleen Whitney. She remembered Trina as being young for her age, and she recalled that she had never met Treva or Ronnie. They never came to any parent meetings or anything. Treva became best friends with a girl named Vicky when she was in 5th grade, and soon they were inseparable. They passed notes, they talked about boys, they spent all their recesses together, they often slept over at each other's houses, and they promised to be best friends forever. Treva gave Vicky a pendant for her birthday in 8th grade and a bracelet with her name engraved on it for Christmas. And even years later, Vicky would keep this jewelry in places of honor in her jewelry box. 8th grade seemed like it was going fine to Vicky. Trina seemed as happy as the next kid, and she even had a boyfriend named David. However, sometime in the spring, things started to change. Trina started to change. She started getting an attitude and skipping school and getting in trouble, and she didn't seem like she cared about anything anymore. Vicky would say, quote, Ken McElroy began coming to school and sitting outside in his big fancy car waiting for Trina. When school was out, Trina would go with him. The school didn't like it, and there was trouble over it, but he kept on doing it, end quote. Trina didn't have time for Vicky anymore. Brenda, Treva's sister and Trina's aunt, was actually married to Russ Johnson, who was a Nottoway County Sheriff's deputy. In 1970, when Trina was about 12 or 13, Russ was out on a call at Graham and decided to stop in at the local junior high dance to check on how things were going. And when he was there, he saw Ken hanging around a junior high dance and talking to Trina. So again, Trina was 12 or 13, and Ken Rex McElroy was 36. So Ken had intimidated Trina's date into picking her up at home and bringing her to meet Ken, and then coming for her later to take her home again so her parents didn't realize what was going on. So Brenda, Russ's wife and Treva's sister, Trina's aunt, confronted Treva, but Treva steadfastly refused that there was anything going on between Trina and Ken Rex McElroy. So to get to school in her area, kids had to ride one bus to Skidmore and then change buses to a different bus that would take them to school in Graham. So Ken would wait for that first bus in Skidmore and then take Trina with him and then bring her home in time to catch that bus back from Skidmore, essentially skipping school. And when she came back, her clothes were usually disheveled, and she would often cry all the way home. The other kids told her to stop going with him, but she still went. And originally it started with him taking her to St. Joe for little outings to buy her gifts and small trinkets and candy, and then to the Tic-Toe Motel in St. George so he could molest her. In 1972, in Trina's freshman year, when she was 14, Trina found out that she was pregnant. And in the fall of that year, she dropped out of school. And that's actually where we are going to end video number 2. I know, Trina is a big player in what is to come next. And so I think there will be probably one more part of this video series, maybe 2. We'll see what happens, but I promise that I'm not going to take as long. I guess I can't promise that. I shouldn't promise that. I really want to promise that I'm not going to take as long to get the next part out because I have plans to film it again tomorrow and get these out over the course of the next several days. But again, my life is unpredictable. It's just so exciting. Who knows? But I'm going to do my best, okay? I'm going to do my best to get this out. If you liked hearing this story and you like true crime, you're interested in it, don't forget to like this video and share it if you thought that it might be a thing that you would like to do. And subscribe so that you can see when I come with more true crime videos. I have dozens of cases that I am planning to cover on this channel, and I would love if you wanted to join me for the ride. And also, if the lighting changed, it's because I'm getting used to this still, so don't judge me. Don't come for me. As my grandma used to say, don't come for me unless I've sent for you. My grandma never said that. But still, don't come for me. I'm doing the best I can. I will get it figured out. Stay tuned. I don't know, subscribe and turn the notification bell on so that you can be notified when my next videos come out. And I will see you guys next time. Bye. Also, I want to leave a little note about some messages that I received on the last video. On my channel, dark humor is a thing, okay? We laugh at stuff that maybe feels like you shouldn't laugh at it, but we're going to do it anyway. We will not cross the line. We will not be making fun of victims here, right? That's a line we're not going to cross, but we will mock the perpetrators all day long, okay? All day long. That just sounds like a good time to me. Studies show that people who use dark humor to cope with trauma or traumatic events in life are more emotionally mature and more intelligent. So, and I can say that because this is YouTube and I don't have to provide citations for why that's correct. Although I promise I did read that in some studies. You can Google it and see what I can find. Anyway, catch you next time. Bye.